Hey guys, welcome back to Macroeconomics. In this class, I'm going to introduce us to macroeconomics. What we've done so far in the class, we're here in this foundations section, is introduce kind of the basics of economic tools that are sort of applicable to both micro and macroeconomics markets, absolute and comparative advantage, specialization in trade, coordination, just kind of the basics of what it is we're doing in economics. Now we're going to really turn and focus on macroeconomics. This is kind of the transition point between foundations and measurement, just to kind of keep you up to date with where we're at in the class. Okay, so what is macroeconomics? Macroeconomics is the study of economic activity from the perspective of the entire economy. So now, macroeconomics is really shaped by three events. Historically, that's what you would say, but obviously we're living in an age now where there's a good argument to be made for a fourth event. The first, modern macroeconomics, is really impacted by the Great Depression. Next, episodes of hyperinflation in various places around the world. And then budget deficit episodes that happened especially in America. And then most recently, we have the Great Recession, which is really another one of those linchpin points in macroeconomic history and macroeconomic study, what economists are worried about and thinking about in the field. So those are the things that are really shaping what it is that economists think about. The field of economics in a modern sense gets traced back to Adam Smith in the late 1700s, actually very similar to around the time that the United States was founded as a nation. And so you've got sort of a relatively recent history in that first period, which we'll talk about a bunch once we get to our actual models section of the class. Is the first thing before the Great Depression that economists are working on is how does a macroeconomy work? But of course, we can trace the study of economics in general much, much further back. There are actually books called The Home Manager that are written in ancient Rome, and they're talking about some of these ideas that sort of laid the foundation of what it is that modern economics is thinking about. But of course, we want to distinguish between economics in the way that we might have thought about it in the old Western tradition as compared to, and I truly mean the old Western tradition there, right? Greece and Rome, as opposed to what's happening now in modern economics, and that's what we're doing here in this class. Okay, so we've got three macroeconomic goals, three things that an economy should be doing for best results, if you will. Okay, the first is full employment. Want to have people working and being productive, and that needs to be paired with price stability. So as you're listening to this episode or this lesson now, we have an episode of pretty significant inflation over the last several years, and that's what we're talking about when we say price stability, not having inflation, not having deflation, not having stagflation, etc. But the most important macroeconomic goal is growth. Okay, so growth kind of trumps everything, if you will. Okay, so we've seen a basic model of how an economy works, and that brings us to this idea of business cycles. Okay, so business cycles are alternating increases and decreases in economic activity. Now, it doesn't seem to always have been the case historically that business cycles were just a common phenomenon, that they were just a part of what we assume happens in a macroeconomy. That's really associated with the last 100 or 120 years or so of history, when we start to see industrialization, modern banking, things like that. So there's a huge discussion to be had there, sort of beyond the scope maybe of this class, although I'll touch on it at different points when we get to them later on in the class. But I even have some great resources if that's a thing that's especially interesting to you. But there are different, mainstream camps of thought in economics that debate what's the nature of business cycles. But first, I just want to discuss kind of what business cycles are. So I'm going to introduce this idea more in a minute, but just bear with me. GDP I'm just going to say that's a way that we measure our productivity. And anytime I use the word real in this class, I'm talking about price adjusted. That's what real means in economic sense. So we're going to have nominal, we're going to have real, more on that in a moment. Real means adjusted for prices. Okay, so what's our total economic activity, GDP? What is it in real terms, adjusting for prices? Well, we see economic activity tends to kind of go up and down. And in the American story, right, there's this general trend upwards, right? So this is my trend line, and the white curves here are the activity. Now, I've drawn them stylized, right, sort of just like up and down and whatnot, right? But, of course, if we show a graph, which we'll have graphs of this later on in the class, right, you'll see that it's very jagged. It's sort of up and down very sharply in long periods of growth with short periods of contraction and so on. Okay, but there are 4 basic periods in a business cycle. The first is a peak. So when we reach the top of our economic growth and productivity, our economic activity is at its highest, we get a peak. And then when we get a downturn, we call that a recession. And that continues until we get to the bottom of the drop of economic activity. We call that the trough. And then we have an expansion. So we have growth, and we have this comeback period of economic activity. And a business cycle is when we go from peak to peak. Okay, so we're here at the peak. Whenever this line comes up, let's just draw it. Whenever this line comes up and begins to go back down, we've got ourselves another peak right here. When we go from peak to peak, like so, that's one business cycle, right? So we're up, we go down, we come back up, turn around to start going back down. That's one business cycle. Okay, so let's define some terms here. Depression is a severe or extended recession. A recession is sort of generally defined as 2 quarters or more of decline in economic activity. This is not the only definition. It's not the strictest definition. For sake of a principles class, it's what I'm going to use. But we actually see quite a bit of discussion in recent years about what's a recession, and we've actually seen the administrative White House try to say, okay, that's not how we define a recession. And there is some truth to that. But it's because we might have situations where we have 1 quarter of negative growth, and then we have a quarter of maybe 0, kind of flat or very, very small positive growth, and then another of significant negative growth, right? So we could draw that. We could show just sort of like a stylized, there's some growth going on, and then we get to this period and there's a big drop, and then there's this little flat area, and then there's a big drop. Are we in a recession? Well, right, we can say, look, here's 1 quarter, quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3. We don't have 2 consecutive periods, 2 consecutive quarters of decline in economic growth, but this is very clearly a recession. Okay, so that's a misleading use of the definitions by administration in recent memory. So for the sake of this class, the only thing I'm going to require that you understand is that a recession is roughly 2 quarters or more consecutively of decline in economic activity. But we actually use measurements and employment, productivity, and several other things to kind of broaden the definition. But if you have 2 consecutive quarters of decline in economic growth, that is a recession, right? So the exception is not we could have 2 consecutive declines and not be in a recession. There's no case where that's true, but we might have a situation where we are in a recession even though we haven't technically had 2 straight quarters of economic decline. Okay, next I want to show us, really quickly, so again, that economic activity, this is our GDP growth domestic product. I'm going to show us that next, so just bear with me on that. So here's a really simple model of a macroeconomy called a circular flow model. And what we're doing in this model is we're saying there's businesses and there's households, and they're connected through the product market and the resource market. Okay, so There's businesses, simplifying, right? In my economy, there are businesses and their households, and they interact in two ways. Businesses produce goods and services, send them to the product market. Households buy goods and services from the product market. In exchange for that, they spend money in order to get those products. We call that consumer spending. And of course, that same consumer spending is revenue for the businesses. Okay, so that kind of makes sense to us. That's intuitively how we think about the economy. But of course, how is it that they produce things? Well, households own inputs. And that doesn't seem like it's true right at first, but remember that households own businesses, they own resources. So they're the ones that actually go about owning all the things, and those get sent to the resource market, and businesses or other businesses purchase those as inputs. So they take them from the resource market into their businesses. What we call factor payments is what they give back in exchange for inputs, right? And then wages or salaries, rents, lots of ways that we'd pay that out. For the sake of this class, I'll just call them wages and salaries, but obviously there's other ways you can make money. So think about it. For most of us, we'll probably think about most of the way that we get resources back in exchange for the resources that we're putting into the market is through income, because our main resources are labor. But imagine you had a rental house and you were renting that out, right? You're a household that owns this resource. It goes into the resource market, and then somebody else is out there getting that, and you're getting payment in rent. That would also be along this section here, okay? So in a simple sense, this is how the economy works. Notice that I've omitted a few things, right? There's no government here. There's no banks here. You can put them into models like this, but it makes it much, much more complex. First time that we introduce the circular flow model, we just want to think about the simplest case. Now, what's really interesting about this is actually like a clean division, sort of the left and right here. The right is what we call the spending side of what's happening in the economy. The left is what we call the income side. And so we can measure, when we go to measure economic activity, we have two ways to do that. We can either use the spending method, and we can measure the consumer spending and the revenue and the products going back and forth. And this is what we're going to do in this class. And in other principles of economics class, we had a different instructor. They might also show you the income method. That's not as common. And so that's just, we have limited time in this class, and you have limited time devoted to the class, so I don't want to take that up. But just know that sometimes you'll see cases where people use the income method in order to measure what's happening in the economy, because remember, we're transitioning from foundations to measurement. This is how we're going to do it. We're going to do it through this idea that we call gross domestic product. Gross domestic product. So what is gross domestic product? It's the total market value. So I'm going to highlight some things as we go, actually. The total market value of all final goods and services produced with resources produced by resources within a given country within a year. Okay, so I got lots of things to unpack here. So let's start to work through it, right? So what do we mean total, right? What we're trying to measure here with gross domestic product is the sum, the whole of the economy. Remember, I'm saying, look, here's my economy. It's in a circular flow, and it kind of has this symmetry. And if I want to measure all of what's happening over here, I'll capture everything that's happening in the economy. Now, GDP doesn't do that perfect, but we're trying to measure the total. We're trying to measure the sum, okay? Next, we're trying to measure the market value, right? One of the things that we're doing here is we could just count up everything that's made, right? And we could say there's been X billion things made by the U.S. economy. What using market value does is it translates those into dollar values. That's like the worst arrow of all time, into dollar values, so that we can sort of have a sensible thing that we add up. So if the country produces 100 fire trucks and it produces 1 million apples, it's not very informative for us to say it's produced 1,100,000 items, just generic things that we just added up. But if I take the market value, and every fire truck is worth $100,000, and say I got $10 million worth of fire trucks, and then every apple costs $1, so I've got $1 million. So I have $11 million of total productivity. It's a proportional way. It keeps track of the different things that we are producing in the economy in a way that actually allows us to sort of add them together. Okay. Next is this idea of final. So there's this production process happening in the economy, right? So if I want to count the number of fire trucks that are being made in the economy, I want to count the fire trucks. What I don't want to do is count, okay, we made tires and we made windshields, we made hoses, we made, gas tanks, engines, on and on and on. Count all of those things individually and then also count the fire truck, because then what I'm doing is I'm double counting. So we only count the things that are final. What that means is when something is produced and it goes to its end use such that it's not being used to produce other things, right? So I produce a tire and then I put it on a car. So now it's being used to produce the car. When I put the car out, that's the final product, and that's what people are using and consuming. Of course, this is a long, tedious process, and I forget if it's the BEA or the Congressional Budget Office that sort of determines how these things get counted, right? But there are economists whose job it is to use systematic ways to help us figure that out. Okay. Next is this idea of within a given country, right? Within a given country, because we want to measure gross domestic product at a national level. Okay, so we're interested in now. Notice I said country here because when we say GDP, it's like implicitly country, but you can measure the GDP of the state of Texas. You can measure the GDP of Randall County. You can measure the GDP of the city of Amarillo. You can do all of these things. So it's probably, if we were more technical, produced by the resources within a given geographic area is what we would say. But just for the sake of the way that you're always going to hear it, your default, if you hear GDP, people are talking about nations. We're not talking about the world. We're not talking about a county, a state, a city, a region. You could do all of those things because we can just say, where are those resources? What are they producing? And then we can measure GDP for that area. Now, we have gross domestic product. We also have an idea called gross national product. The simple idea here is GDP says what are the resources within these borders, and GNP says what are the resources as owned by a particular set of citizens. So if a U.S. citizen owns resources that are in Ireland and those get used to produce something, GDP will count those as Irish GDP, and GNP will count that as U.S. GDP. Okay, both are valid, both are legitimate, and they have their different uses. It's most common to just kind of keep it the simplest possible, things that are made here regardless of who owns them, using resources that are here regardless of who owns them, get counted as GDP. Okay, so as I mentioned before, there are two ways to measure GDP, the income method, the spending method. I've shown you both of those. In this class, we're going to use the spending method. I'm not going to ask you to spend any time worrying or thinking about the income method. Just know that that exists. If you end up in an econ class later on and they say we're going to use the income method for measuring GDP, that's going to be something you're going to need to brush up on. It's not a big deal. But most of the time, we're going to see the spending method used. And the spending method defines GDP as the following. So gross domestic product is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus what we call net exports, which is exports minus imports. Okay, so what's consumption? That's that consumer spending. What's investment? That's when a firm is doing some kind of spending in order to go about making other things, right? Government spending, of course, the government can spend money in sort of a similar way that consumers do, right? So when they go and they buy a fire truck, right? Most fire trucks can be owned by governments. That's spending, and that goes into GDP measurement here. Okay, an export is when something that's been produced in the United States gets sold overseas, and an import is the opposite, when something produced overseas gets purchased in the United States. Since we're using the spending method, we want to be careful, right? Because suppose that I just kind of ignored this whole section, right? And I just look at this stuff, and I say it's consumption plus investment plus government spending, right? Well, have I captured all of the productivity that's happening in the economy? Well, obviously not, right? Because there's some stuff that we're producing, but we're not the ones buying. So it kind of goes out of that circular flow. And what I want to do, remember, I'm doing something really, really specific here. I'm trying to measure economic activity, okay? This is a measurement thing. It's not about policy prescriptives. I'm not trying to make judgment calls about whether things are good or bad, right? And that's where people get confused by the net exports thing, right? And so they say, well, our GDP is higher if our exports are higher, therefore exports being higher is good. That's actually true in a sense, because more economic activity is better, but the corollary is that imports must be bad. And that's not true, right? Importing is good, exporting is good. Both of these things are good things. But if what I'm trying to do is measure economic activity, what do I need to measure? I need to measure the things that we're producing. What are the things that we're producing? We're producing things that are being consumed here, that we also produced here, things that our businesses are investing in here, things that governments are purchasing that are produced here, things that other people are producing other nations are purchasing that are produced here. But these things that are being imported are things that other people produced that we're buying. So if I just say, okay, let me just measure all the purchasing power that happened in the United States. What am I doing? Well, I'm measuring consumption, investment, government spending, and I'm adding imports. Well, that would be the wrong number, right? Because then I'm adding something that somebody else produced in there. Okay, so this is a huge economic fallacy that people make a mistake as they say, look, these net exports is often called the trade deficit. Trade deficit, and we'll have more on this in a future lecture. So I'm just going to put it here. Does not matter. And so when I say it doesn't matter, I'm going to say it doesn't matter for policy. Okay? Because the lesson that I want us to learn here is, what are we trying to do? We're trying to measure something. Okay? Say we're trying to measure, this is my semi-truck. Okay? I'm trying to measure this semi-truck and see how much it weighs. But it has this big rock on the back. Okay? Now I'm trying to measure the weight of the thing, and I put it on this scale. What's the problem with this? Well, I'm not measuring the truck. I'm measuring the truck plus the rock on the back. What do I need to do? Well, I need to know the weight of the rock. That's import, right? In fact, let's be cute about it. Let's put, these are like imports here, right? I need to factor out the weight of that rock when trying to find the weight of the truck. Does that make sense? So it's not that imports are good or bad. It's actually that I'm trying to measure something specific, but sort of in the process right now, baked in, are these imports. I need to factor them out, just like I need to factor out the weight of the rock in order to figure out the weight of the truck. Okay. So there's a big lesson here that I want to drive home, and that's, remember, economic activity is good. Economic activity is good. Probably shouldn't have to spend much time convincing you. And so the consequence is actually X plus M being higher is good. Okay, so we want both more exports and more imports. So just because I've got this guy sitting here in this term, say, oh, well, therefore we should want imports to go down and we should want exports to go up, and that'll make us better and stronger as an economy. Not true. We're just trying to measure economic activity. Okay, I digress. Just some couple of quick points here, right? To kind of give you a sense of the different component parts of GDP, I'm going to talk about what those are, largest and small. These are just roughly true. If you looked up these numbers, they might be, I won't say substantially, but non-trivially different today than they might have been at different time periods. Consumption is roughly 70% of GDP, investment 20%, government spending 15%. Of course, for you math whizzes at home, you notice that's 5% over 100%, and that's because net exports are negative 5%. That means we're importing a little bit more than we're exporting. Okay, another quick point, just because this is a thing we're going to deal with later on in the class, and I want us to have seen it already, is personal income versus disposable income. Your personal income is all your income. Your disposable income is your personal income less your taxes, and that's going to factor into consumption and government spending later on. Okay, now, importantly, GDP is the market value, not the quantity of things, and it's measuring current production. So we want to keep in mind, what is GDP doing? It's a dollar amount because it's a market value of things, and it's the current production It's not past, it's not future. It's what happens in a given time period. We just want to be clear about what it is that we're doing. Now, GDP is not perfect. What we're trying to do is measure production, but it misses some things, right? Household production. If you mow your own lawn, that's in a real sense production, but it's not being traded on the open market, and so we don't have a dollar value of that going into the economy. You do your dishes, you do your laundry, you mow your lawn. Those things don't get picked up in official measures of GDP. Okay. There's also an underground economy, and I say underground, not just black market, because yes, that includes black market, right? But it also just includes underground activity that's not actually, illicit in any sense, right? So you don't want to mow your own lawn, you give the neighbor kid $20. He's not reporting that to the IRS, right? And so that's not being picked up in GDP. That's part of the underground economy, and that really is a sort of broader category. Okay, now sometimes you're going to see GDP used as a measure of well-being. They're going to say, look, people are better in the United States because GDP is higher. And those two things are correlated, but of course I hopefully don't have to spend a lot of time trying to convince you that your well-being is not strictly tied to your material well-being. There are many factors in life outside of your own personal productivity, which obviously, your income, your purchasing power, your productivity are factors in your well-being, but they're not the only factors. And GDP, trying to measure well-being at a national level, remember it's not trying to measure individual, right, but at a national level, it misses some things, right? And so it's actually a much worse measure. It's not even really intended to be a measure of well-being, but it gets used that way, so I'm going to address it. It misses some things. It misses leisure. If two countries are exactly identical and one works more hours and therefore produces more, it'll look like, if you're using GDP as a measure of well-being, it'll look like it's way better, right? But maybe those people would be happier if they had more time off, if they had longer weekends, whatever. Next is negative externalities, right? So if you've got of course, a lot of these could actually be directly related to productivity, to production, right? You got two countries, they're exactly identical. One produces more, but it pollutes its environment more. Are those people necessarily going to be happier? Not necessarily, right? And not necessarily in either direction. But just to say GDP is going to miss an offsetting cost that has to do with their production, right? Their production, if they produce an extra $100 million worth of GDP, but they have $50 million worth of negative externalities, GDP is going to measure that as 100 more in benefit when really it's just 50 more in net benefit. Okay, obviously it doesn't pick up crime or social problems, right? So you can have a country that's more productive but has more crime or social problems, and that's the well-being of the people in those countries going to be affected by that. And then finally, of course, there's a distributional effect. GDP is going to measure an average, right? And so you can have some countries with really high levels of inequality, and yes, they're very productive. Classic examples of this would be like Middle Eastern oil countries, right, that have extraordinary levels of wealth, but they're extraordinarily unequal in their distribution, right? So on average, they're some of the most wealthy countries in the world, but that wealth is concentrated very, very heavily at the top. And so your average well-being will be quite a bit lower than your GDP would suggest. Okay, so as promised, I want to turn to the real versus nominal idea, right? So GDP measures value. So correcting for price is very, very important, because if the price is changing, then our measurement of the value will be different at different time periods. So what's nominal GDP? That is simply summing the current values of the final goods and services up to get GDP. What's real GDP? That's when you take the prices of goods and services in a particular year to calculate the value so that we can compare across years. Okay, and I'll make this more clear here in a minute. But you do that by designating a base year. You say 2000. Usually we use round numbers, 2000, 2010, 2020, and so on. And this allows you to calculate something very important called purchasing power, right? So what the dollar is on its face, right? You got $5, is not so important. It's what can you buy with it. if you have $5 today, what can you get with it, right? Well, it's hard to even get like a fast food meal for $5. You might get a couple things off of a dollar menu somewhere, right? Go back 100 years and have $5 and you'll feed a family of 4 at a decent restaurant, right? And so this highlights the importance of prices versus nominal values. Okay, let's make this concrete though, so we can sort of work this out and have it clear in our mind. So let's calculate some GDP, right? So suppose that in the year 2015, we're just going to measure the production of trucks, right? So obviously GDP is a measure of all final goods and services, but for the sake of example, I'm going to say, okay, this country only produces trucks, right? And here it is, and it's producing trucks. It produces 500,000 trucks, and those trucks are $80,000 a piece, right? Well, then we know that we've got $40 billion in production there. $40 billion in production, okay? The next year, they only produce 400,000 trucks, right? But they have produced, but the price of those trucks goes up to 100,000. Now we know we've produced 44 billion. Both of these are nominal measures. Nominal measures, right? So how do we compare between 2015 and 2016? Because it looks like we have $4 billion more in total productivity in the economy, but do we? Well, the way that we do that is we designate a base year. I'm going to just note that as oops, sorry, I put that in the wrong category. I'm going to designate the base year as 2015, so I'm going to use the number of trucks produced in 2016 at the price that they were worth in 2015. And then when I cross-calculate those things, we can see we actually have produced less in real GDP comparing 2016 to 2015. Okay, so this gives us one way to actually account for price changes using our GDP numbers. We call that the GDP deflator, and that's just the nominal GDP divided by the real GDP times 100. And so obviously you can do that here. You can see that our GDP deflator is going to show that there's been inflation here because we've got our GDP controlling for our production units, and so the change happens in the price here. So our nominal GDP divided by our real GDP. So in that case, that would be this divided by this times 100 would give us that number. Okay, let's do another example really quickly and simply just so that the numbers are sort of very straightforward to us, right? So we've got a country, they produce 3 pairs of socks. Those socks cost $1 a piece. That gives us $3 in nominal GDP in 2020. In 2021, though, they move forward. They produce 4 pairs of socks at $2 a piece. Wow, not GDP went all the way up to $8, right? But say, wait a minute, our base year at 2020, we take this price, use it here, but we take this quantity, use it here. So now I got the real GDP in 2021, and we see that actually our real GDP is $4. So let's calculate our GDP deflator, right? And it's the nominal, over the real times 100. So we know that we've got 200 as our factor. So we've actually had how much inflation? Right, double. So pretty straightforward.